Thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm going to invite you to join the other panelists for this next part of our discussion. And so I will briefly introduce each of the other four panelists. This is the topic on the long view, lessons from the history of religious extremism. And so in addition to Tobias, I will not be introducing him because you've just heard from him, but I will start with Professor Michel Sun-Lee. And Michel Sun-Lee is a historian of religion in North America. She completed her doctorate in religious studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and also holds an MBA in history and a BA in history and East Asian studies from Stanford University. Dr. Lee's current book project looks at the history of Sabbath keeping amongst Protestants and others in the American West between 1848 and 1920. Her research interests include gender-based violence in conservative Christian communities in North America. At Southern, Professor Lee also serves as the director of the Southern Scholars Honors Program. So please help join me in welcoming Professor Lee. And I've asked each of our panelists to just give a 1 to 2 minute introduction of their own before we start delving into questions. So, Michel.
So as Jennifer mentioned, my work looks at the topic of sacred time, and specifically weekly cycles of sacred timekeeping, especially in the American West, where there is no historic Protestant establishment in the way that we find in the Eastern United States. So my questions are, when we look at a context like that, how is it that so quickly we see the establishment of laws, Sunday laws, essentially, or other sumptuary laws that enforce these kind of Protestant norms? And I look at the arguments that are made for and against those laws, as well as the coalitions, the unlikely coalitions that are formed in those debates. In addition, I'm interested in the lived experiences of Protestants, Jews, Catholics, and what some would call religious nuns in that context, and how they experience sacred time.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Preston Foster. He is the assistant professor and program director of public policy at Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama. Preston is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education and a White House Fellow. He served as assistant vice president of interactive learning at Educational Testing Services and as a national account manager for AT&T. He founded whattheyshouldsay.org, which is a not-for-profit political messaging company, and is also the co-founder of Sage Products, LLC. He is a graduate of Pine Forge Academy and Oakwood University and Harvard University. Thank you, Preston.
It's so good to be here, and thank you for having us. I teach political science at Oakwood University, and the first class that I teach is Introduction to Political Science. We try to make it clear to our students, because I think you might understand that this generation of students is not necessarily committed to Adventism. And so we try to explain to them in the context of the Adventist prophetic narrative why they, as laymen and lay women, have a ministerial role in understanding the importance of separation in church and state in the context of our prophecies. It is not at all clear that most students understand why they're Adventists. Many of them are cultural Adventists. Many of them are instinctive Adventists. But those, particularly those who are born and raised in Adventism, don't really understand what Adventism is about. And we believe that what Adventism is about is explaining to the world, in the public policy world, in the legal world, why church and state needs to be separate. And in particular, why religious people who are for the separation of church and state have a unique role in American society.
Our next panelist is Andrew Polk. He is an award-winning teacher and scholar at of American Religious History and an associate professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University. He holds degrees from Lipscomb University, Hazlitt School of Theology, Yale Divinity School, and Florida State University. His research focuses on U.S. religion and politics, and he has published articles and essays in numerous academic journals. His first book from Cornell University Press, called Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion, examines the religious propaganda campaigns of Presidents Roosevelt Franklin, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. Welcome.
Thank you very much. When I was trying to figure out how to do a tease for all of this, I decided to go with the most disappointing thing I found in my research, which is always the greatest place to start. Have y'all heard the term families that pray together stay together, right? I assumed this was from some Southern Baptist minister at some point, or maybe something from the moral majority through the 80s. I discovered that term that I had heard most of my life came from advertising executives in the late 1940s, specifically from a group called the Advertising Council that worked on behalf of the U.S. government, funded by corporate business interests, to convince Americans what the government wanted them to know. So much so, they did this during the Second World War, Rosie the Riveter, loose lips sink ships, right? Smokey the Bear, all this. They were so good at it that I was astounded to find on White House memo a letter to them inviting them to come to the White House after the war for literally, quote, secret indoctrination talks. The President, Vice President, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State, among others. And they were so good at this that the government kept them going for another 2 decades. And much of what we think of Judeo-Christian tradition at the heart of America and religious foundations and the core of what we call white Christian nationalism was a political project in the 1940s and 50s.
I look forward to hearing more about that. Our final panelist is Michel Campbell. He is a Seventh-day Adventist historian, theologian, pastor, and educator. In 2022, he was appointed Director of Archives, Statistics, and Research at the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists. Dr. Campbell completed a BA at Southern University and his MA and PhD from Andrews University. He's also written numerous articles and books on Adventist history. So welcome, Michel.
Thank you very much. So my little teaser, I guess, is looking at, with today's topic, with religious liberty and Christian nationalism, you find things that you don't expect at times as well. And that happened to me looking at Adventism and fundamentalism. And I started going down that path for theological interests, but in the process of that, started discovering that had profound sociological implications for Adventism. So in terms of women who were very involved in the early founding of our church, you start seeing those voices, women's voices being eclipsed. You can also see that in terms of race, pioneers that were very abolitionist and socially active by the early 20th century. You even see some denominational leaders, not all, but some, that were becoming active in the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan, which was very shocking, probably one of those shocking things I've ever found in my research. But that has led to other questions, and so the research goes on. But I have a lot of fun. I have the privilege to try to encourage the preservation of Adventist history across our denomination, encouraging research. And on Monday this week, I think I may have made the most significant discovery of a primary source document of our early pioneers that I've ever found, and that is the original document in Maine of one of the early periodicals that was thought to be missing, and we now have the original copy. It was misfiled and misplaced, and we'll have a big major announcement about that find here in the next couple of weeks. But it's fun when you find original sources, and that's part of the delight of historical research, I think, for most people.
Thank you. I'm really excited about the panel discussion that we're going to have. And the format that we're going to use is that I have some broad questions, and I'm going to direct them to specific individuals, but then I've asked the panelists to all weigh in on these questions. We're just going to kind of get to listen in on their discussion as they talk about these issues. So I'm going to go on and start with the first question. And this is, again, a broad question. And the question is, how does religion and how has religion related to political power? And this can be both internationally and also within the United States. And so I'm going to pose this question to Tobias to take the lead.
But no, I think the comparative angle is really interesting here because we, of course, see very different settlements of church-state relations, both historically and across the world. And very often we think it's quite binary. It's either you have a state church or you have a separation of state and church. It's either secular or basically a theocracy. And we've seen that theocracy is not a good idea, neither for the state nor for religion. You've seen that big part of European history has been warfare, religious warfare between states that thought that they were religious entities. If you think about the 30 Years' War that killed about half of the European population, and as a result, it's often seen that 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, was the big breakthrough for secularism, where people realized, oh, if you mix politics and religion too much, all you're going to have is crusades and people just annihilating each other. And then you had the idea of basically separation of church and, state and church. But maybe the thing that I want to say here is also that it's not that binary. That actually what you have in Europe nowadays in many ways is not necessarily state churches and everybody has to be a member of the state church. That's basically not the case anymore since the 17th century. But what you have is basically either a very clear separation of state and church, like you have in France, where to some extent secularism almost has become the state religion. You have to be secular. You can't be, like, secularism is a value in itself. And if you talk to French people, they will actually say that the secular school is the Church of the Republic. And then on the other hand, you basically have what in my research a lot of people have called more of a moderate secularism. And there we can actually see that if you have, for instance, in Germany we call it benevolent neutrality, that you can actually still have a relationship between church and state that doesn't necessarily need to be purely negative. You can be neutral and allow for religion to be free, for religious freedom to blossom, and at the same time the state recognizing that religion is something good, and it's some way of the direction where you are going, Andrew, and that is actually quite interesting, because in Europe it was at the same time, after the Second World War, basically where people were saying, oh, on the one hand we had Nazism, who were atheists and basically said, we want the final, Hitler himself said, if you don't, we do the final solution of the Jews, but the real big final solution will be the final solution of the church. That's the next project. So the Christians were or Democrats were worried about Nazism, and then you had communism. What they basically said, though, is the problem of the secular state kind of resides on values that it cannot itself guarantee. And therefore they said religion is something good, and religion should be seen as a positive, like if you think about it as like a source of what's the word? Bob Putnam's social capital, thank you. And recognizing that. So basically this is like my comparative point here, that in some ways it's really disappointing if you realize that your civil religion has been engineered by the state. But in many ways, there can actually be something very positive in civil religion. And I would just warn from the binary of saying either pure secularism or state church. There's a big space in between.
Well, for me, the lens that you look through kind of determines what you see. And when I read the Bible looking at it through a church-state lens, I see a recurring theme of theocracies being used to validate the identity of the true God. And by that I mean, if you think of the three Hebrew boys and Nebuchadnezzar, that was about the identity of the true God versus the coercion of the state. The same thing with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. But for me, the most vivid example is the crucifixion of Christ. Because in that case, the church went to the state to get permission to kill Christ. And it was very political. They took him to Pilate. Pilate was the governor. Pilate saw nothing wrong with him, but the church still wanted him crucified. And so then when Pilate was pressed, he had a referendum to say, would you like Christ or Barabbas? And he thought it was a rhetorical question. But the crowd said, we want Barabbas, crucify Christ. So it was the church going to the state to get the authority to do what the church wanted done in society. And so if we look through that lens, we see this recurring theme of theocracies being used to validate the true identity of Christ. And I think that we are in that time again today.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question, unless Andrew did. Okay, because I'm going to start with you for the next question anyway. So prepare yourself.
Eye contact with the teacher. You don't do it.
So I want to talk about any historical examples that you can talk about where you've seen this church-state collusion. And I think this is, part of what you have done research on, correct?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have anywhere near enough time to pick any decade in American history to talk about church-state collusion. It hasn't been, it's not a new thing. This isn't something that has been brought about because our current situation, but the context continuously change, right? So I think part of the difference is because of my work is seeing where this modern version was created, the legacies of that. So the shortest version is the US government was trying to figure out a way to unite Americans. Principally, this is Franklin Roosevelt before the US entered World War II. By this point, by the late 30s, he had decided that America needed to enter the war. America wasn't. He needed to unite everyone to be the arsenal of democracy. How do you unite Americans? We're so diverse. You can't do it. You can't say race. You can't say ethnicity. You can't say class. What they decided was religion. All Americans are basically the same. Catholic, Protestant, or Jew, and those are really the same thing anyway, right? Because of the Judeo-Christian religion, which was a term that was coined in the late 30s. And so they went about convincing this is what brings Americans together. Americans are religious, but the religion, right? Dwight Eisenhower's famous for this, right? We're to be religious, I don't care what it is. Now, he's personally had more theology and doctrine that he cared about. For America, it didn't matter. And so the faith of America, this civil religion that we have, was in its time a wartime in which Americans are religious. And what does that mean? It means we're the good ones. That's what it means. We are on the side of God, not the Nazis, and then not the Soviets. And by the way, the Ad Council recycled almost all of their adverts from World War II afterwards in the early Cold War, and they just replaced Nazi with Soviet. There's no difference, literally no difference in the typing, because they're the godless evil ones. But the helpful thing with communism was, well, the enemy of religion is not secularism, it's not the devil, it's socialism. Because socialism is not just against God, it's also against free markets. And the socialists will take our religion, so we must always have a massive, consistent military presence throughout the world, which used to be anathema to the American experiment, right? One of the few things the founders agreed on was large standing armies kill democracies. After World War II, everyone said it's impossible. Technology has advanced too much. And then the other aspect is, because of all those are true, if you criticize America, you hate America. You're a traitor. You're helping the enemy. most especially on racial injustice. And this was a political project that was sold as a religious revival. And families that pray together, stay together. It was on advertisements, it was on billboards. You couldn't go to a movie. You could not buy bread, a loaf of bread, without having Religion and American Life on the back. The easiest short example of this is in the month of November of '49, when Religion and American Life started, just in advertising for the radio, they measured it on listener impressions. One listener impression was one American or one household had heard the message once in its entirety. In the month of November, there were 500 million listener impressions for Religion and American Life. The population of the US was 150 million. There's no greater, more successful advertising campaign than Religion and American Life. And it has formed everything that we think of, these tropes and rhetoric and ideas, ever since.
One thing that when I'm talking about this topic is really important for my students to understand is that we don't have this narrative of secularization as scholars of Lutheran religion, right? As historians, that there's not this sense that, well, America is kind of cleansing us all of this entanglement between church and state as time goes on. It comes in different forms. And, you know, you've given a great example from the 20th century. I think if we look at the 19th, we see something similar, just with different language. This idea of a Christian nation is quite explicit. In fact, I'm thinking of a legal case involving a Jewish man in Pennsylvania, Wolf, and the case is Wolf v. Commonwealth from 1817. And he says, well, I'm commanded to work 6 days of the week. So he works on Sunday, he's arrested, and then he's told in court that his interpretation of the Sabbath commandment doesn't matter because this is explicitly a Christian nation. In fact, many of those Sunday laws from the 19th century and before then talk about Sunday as, quote, and I wrote it down actually, that it's a day to exercise the duties of piety and true religion. I mean, it's obviously Christian language, and that doesn't necessarily disappear in the 20th century. It just takes a slightly different form as there's an attempt at disestablishment and yet these enduring continuities in this collusion between church and state.
I was going to ask you actually to talk about that next. Go on, Preston.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this language, this kind of conflation of religious and political language is part of American culture. The notion of America being a shining city on a hill goes back to John Winthrop in 1639. I remember recalling Ronald Reagan in 1976 when he just lost the Republican nomination and was making his concession speech using the exact same language. And I remember seeing tears coming down people's eyes because the notion of America being a shining city on a hill goes back to colonial America, puritanical America. And there's this conflation that America was begun as a Christian nation, but that was our Puritan fathers. Our founding fathers separated church and state at the convention, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And so differentiating between colonial America and founding America is the difference between America being a Christian nation and America being a nation where religious freedom exists.
And I'm going to ask you another question, Preston, since you were just talking, and that is, how does political privilege enable the flourishing of religious extremism? And how have we seen this in history, the political privilege impacting extremism?
Well, in my mind, privilege is always the asset of those in the majority. So if you look at American religious history, it was either the Puritans or those who were in Jamestown and were advancing the Church of England. And those who were in the minority at the time were the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Baptists. And now, when you look at Christian America, the Baptists, the Methodists, Presbyterians, and Catholics are the majority. And so it really depends on where and when you look at the religious makeup of America as to who has the privilege of defining what religion means in America. Because religion in America actually has as much of a secular definition as it does a religious one, if not more. But that definition is defined by those in the religious majority at the time.
Find that to be the case during your comparative studies as well, Tobias?
So it's actually a really interesting issue, because I think on the one hand, this is again where it's a lot of gray zones. Because on the one hand, you can of course have this, what I mentioned earlier, this claim of cultural hegemony, that if you think you have the monopoly over this is a Christian nation, and if you think about civil religion, actually, I mean, it dates back not just to the 1950s, it became stronger in the 1950s, but initially being a Christian nation meant being a Protestant nation. And then it was a Christian nation because at some point Catholics were okay. And then it became a Judeo-Christian nation. But what that also shows is that actually, to some extent, this is malleable. This can be open. Privilege can also be extended to different communities, and communities can be integrated into that. And I would actually, to some extent, caution from too strict separation, because what we see, for instance, in Europe, is that communities, especially Islamic communities, that feel that they are really, that there is no way for them to publicly practice their religion, that they are really not privileged at all, that they really don't have the same rights. There's a very strong separation of church and state, for instance, in France, and there you actually see much stronger countercultural radicalization in many of these communities. And it's not limited to Islam. You can actually currently see the same development in, say, Catholic communities in France, where they are now a minority, and the majority culture is becoming increasingly secular, and there's now a whole victimhood narrative that is fueled by that, and then the Catholics will basically say, we now do the Benedict option. If you think about Rod Dreher, we are doing the Benedict option. We are retreating from this society. We are doing our own things, and we don't want to be involved. But the problem is, then in some ways, a religion that is universalist and open towards the public becomes much more of a sect, much more closed off. And then we can actually also see very strong trends of secularization. So I think finding an equilibrium between, on the one hand, having a monopoly and a claim for cultural hegemony, and on the other hand, the sense of being excluded from society. And I think this is really where we have to find a compromise. And as I said, in some parts of Europe, and I think in some ways, the compromise of the 1950s wasn't the worst compromise, because if you're in a society where 95% are Jewish or Christian, most people feel integrated. The problem is obviously now where that changes. And the question is, how can you expand? How can you have an inclusive idea of civil religion that actually includes rather than excludes? And I think that's the big challenge, because in some ways we will always have a sacred narrative. Every nationalism does. And then it's the question, how can we have a national narrative, a national myth that is as inclusive as possible?
We've talked about America primarily, and you're bringing, geographically to other parts of the world, to Europe. You can certainly see that, but also in Adventist way of thinking, for Ellen White's great controversy, she spends so much time focused on Luther. So the Reformation is it's this bright spot, and yet you look at Calvin with Servetus, and you have even Luther himself, so these are, and you have the Anabaptists that rise up as a reaction to that. And I know within our Adventist way of thinking theologically, we like to at least idealize that we come out of this Anabaptist tradition, right? Where we recognize that political power always has that temptation to corrupt. Yeah.
Sure.
I think the phrase that keeps coming up when I talk to people across different Christian denominations and different traditions, especially transnational Islam, It's said sometimes in different ways, but the crux of it is an understanding / justification. It's reasonable. If I believe I have some understanding of the world, certainly that it's ordained by God. I understand the way the world works. I understand the way that people are created. I understand what's good for them. If I don't take power and do good with it, someone else will. But the good they may do may be evil. And so I need to find the good. I need to keep the good. And then if you get the power, you have to maintain the power, because if you don't have the power, then you can't do any good. If I don't exist, I can't do good. And the difficulty of this is, as soon as you see, is it allows me to justify anything. If power equals good, I only need to get and maintain power. And so our rhetoric often gives us away. I theologically, I think that is the opposite of the ethic of Jesus Christ. But it's so very human. And I have not come across a group that doesn't say it to me.
What a great point there. Thank you for jumping in there. We have about 10 minutes left, and so I do want to make sure we get to this last question at least. And this one I'm going to pose to you initially, Michael, but I would love for the rest of you to weigh in. I think that maybe Preston and Michel may feel more comfortable weighing in on this one, but Tobias and Andrew, feel free to weigh in as well if you would like. And this deals with Adventism and our church's response. What has been our historic response to religious extremism?
Yeah, so I think Adventism in its earliest form, as it started as sort of like this countercultural movement. So it's activist, social reform, but as Adventism has become a global movement, as it has in some parts of the world has become a majority church where it has actually some prestige and political power in certain countries, that temptation has always been there, right? So we can think of examples of Adventists during World War II. Adventists in Germany especially loved Hitler because he was vegetarian. And so there's these kinds of things. We look back, how is that possible? But it happened, right? We have in Africa with the Rwandan genocide, right? That temptation where the church was starting to have a lot of power. You have this breakout of strife and tribalism, and it's horrific now that we look back at it. But yet we see there were denominational leaders that were at the forefront of some of those massacres, and so we have examples of both, where we can see certainly our church has inculcated this sense of religious freedom from the various earliest beginnings, are a part of our DNA. It's part of who we are. But we've also not been immune to the temptation where sometimes that temptation to political power is just almost irresistible. One last quick example, we were living in a country overseas, so outside of North America, so I'm not trying to pick in any place, and that particular political leader is no longer in power. But at the time, that person was known as being basically a dictator and was killing off people and these kinds of things. And so, and challenged some of the other religious leaders in that country. And then when he challenged those religious leaders, he publicly said, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to become Seventh-day Adventist. And suddenly in that country, there were Adventists all over the place saying, hallelujah, we are going to have a president who is going to be on our side. And the question to me was did that political leader actually believe what we believe and share our values? Because he's actually, from my perspective, antithetical to everything that Adventism theologically stands for. You know, we don't believe in murdering people, right? And so this kind of, just for the sake of argument here, and yet I saw the temptation was there that to subscribe to that, and people were excited. So we're not immune to it, but we celebrate those moments in our Adventist past where our church has upheld and stayed true and consistent to those values of being countercultural and stood for that. One more quick example, I love that our earliest Adventist pioneers, and there's a good friend of mine, Kevin Burton, I think he taught here at Southern for a while, that is just completing his dissertation on the abolitionist roots of our pioneers. And I know there's other different examples, but that was very countercultural. And I love that we have that history. It's coming more and more to the forefront, that we're seeing just how much that what we believe changes our politics. It changes our political outlook rather than allowing our politics to change our beliefs. And so we need to kind of keep that framework foremost in our minds.
Reminds me of something that Orland says, does your faith impact your politics, or is your politics impacting your faith? Just a little plug for Faith and Politics. It's a great show. Please watch it. Michel or Preston, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that international perspective is so important to keep us from valorizing what we see predominantly, I think, in the United States. Looking at Adventists' attitude towards politics here has been quite, would you say, oppositional in many ways, at least publicly. So think of all the opposition to Sunday laws on municipal, state, federal levels that Adventists are quite vocal about. And in quite, I think, interesting ways. They do it with a lot of attitude at times. I think of a Sunday law that's passed in California in the early 1850s and involves some sort of clause about staying silent on that day. And it's really important for these white evangelicals to have silence publicly. And Adventists then comment in our periodicals saying, well, why do we need to enforce public silence when true worship is the silence of the soul? And so they say really interesting things like that. And yet when we look overseas, I would say, yes, there are instances of collusion as well as resistance. And I think there's also a liminal space where they say very little. I think of Korea, for example, during the Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. Adventists seem to comment very little, at least in our denominational publications, about that. And certainly I, as a Korean American, looking at that, I really struggled with my feelings through those sources. Like, how come we didn't say more to an imperial power that was essentially raising the peninsula?
One quick thing, though, that I think there was a tipping point in the early 20th century with World War I and fundamentalism as kind of a shift where we see our church changing significantly. In World War I, with the rise of fundamentalism, one litmus test of observing this is if you look at pictures of our early churches and inside, there were prophecy charts and maps and different kinds of things, but you would never see a United States flag. But in World War I, in the wider culture and in Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist churches, you start seeing American flags in the front to the point where it becomes ubiquitous. I think most people don't think about it, but having lived and served in other places of the world, I've asked other Adventists who visit America maybe for the first time, and asked, what strikes you as unusual? And almost inevitably, one of the things they'll say is, I can't believe there's an American flag in the front of church. I didn't even look to see. Oh, sure enough, there is one here. There you go.
The modern Adventist church is very much institutionalized. And that institutionalization has kind of manifested itself in a Laodicean response to what I view as the so-called image of the beast, that is apostate Protestantism in the United States, being the catalyst to the integration or attempts to integrate church and state. And I think it's kind of a dangerous silence because as we become more institutionalized, we seek to become more mainstream. And in my view, that's the exact opposite of what we should be. We are here to call out truth, not to create tension, but to be a filter for what is actually God's truth in these last days. So I teach because I believe that the institutional Adventist church, and I'm a preacher's kid, so I'm not bashing the church, but I believe the institutional Adventist church is not going to finish the work. I think, as Mrs. White said, the lay people of this church will be the ones to call it out. And what we're trying to teach our students at Oakwood, and I'm sure you're teaching your students here at Southern, is that as lawyers, as public servants, as citizens, it's incumbent on us to call out the collusion between church and state, especially when it meets or fits the interests of the church.
Thank you. We have about 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask one follow-up question, and it's for you, Michael. And I read your both of your books actually, and on the impact of embracing the fundamentalist movement within the Adventist Church. And so my question is, how do you see that embrace impacting how we respond to extremism? And do you think that we have moved away from embracing that period of fundamentalism, or are we still in that period?
I like to say that history is messy, it's complicated, right? So it's not just you can compartmentalize. And I think in this case, certainly that fundamentalist trajectory through the 20th century, you can still see it there. But I would say it's more nuanced, it's fragmented, and again, you see other more moderate strains within Adventism that have kind of pulled away and pulled back from that. But it certainly has impacted Adventism in profound ways that somewhat, I think we really haven't realized, and just race and gender happen to be two very easy examples. Another example I'm writing my next book on is last generation theology. So this idea of perfectionism, you have to be perfect to bring about the eschaton, and that can be traced directly to fundamentalism. So yes, it's ongoing. No, it's not a simple direct link. It's very, very complicated, and that story, I think we're living out that story, right? Because we're seeing how challenging that is. How do we create constructive conversations in the church? And not only theologically, but with many other issues right now with current politics and vaccines and masks and everything else. And then those kinds of issues of polarization, they've been there, but the people and the issues have changed, but the underlying sociological and many other theological things that are underpinning it continue to drive those conversations.
Thank you. Thank you all for this very engaging discussion. Please join me in thanking the panelists.